welcome to our viewers watching in on the live stream as well. So we've got about an hour together for those of us in the room. I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes on the presentation, which our viewers will join us on, and then I'm going to ask you to do a bit of work, if that's okay. So good that there's many of you, so you can kind of hopefully get some good conversations going. So just a bit of an introduction. There are 3.5 million women in employment between the ages of 50 and 65 in the UK. And we're going to talk a little bit about symptoms shortly, but whereas, perhaps you might have kind of, as women, grown up thinking, well, menopause, it's just, yeah, right, you stop your periods, that's it. Actually, symptoms are probably lasting between about 4 and 8 years on average, and about 5% of women are saying, well, it's more like 12 years. So not just a moment in time. Where in the workplace, when we're thinking particularly about the workplace, we might expect, that there to be fear of stigmatisation and ridicule is common, and poise and control are very much valued. Menopause is definitely seen as a taboo subject. So what I'm hoping that we're just going to talk about in the brief presentation now is the facts, what's going on with the menopause, why do we have it. I'm going to share with you a little a bit about the research in menopause, one particular study which has been the basis of a lot of recent work, particularly in the workplace. Then that's the bit where I'm going to ask you to just be, do a bit of work for me. And finally then a few slides on what guidance is out there that's already, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, somebody else has done that for us. And maybe then lastly just have a think about what are the next steps for our organisation. So menopause, the stopping of that monthly cycle. So the clinical definition would be 12 months of consecutive amenorrhea, we call it, but no periods. And obviously that's easy if you haven't got the complications of hormonal treatment or whatever. We can make that diagnosis easy. The perimenopause, which if you're into social media and there's been kind of an increasing awareness on television programs and things like that in the newspapers, the perimenopause is what we would call it from the onset of symptoms to that menopause, so at the end of that actual transition. Why do we have a menopause? Well, when we're in our mum's tums as women, that's when we have about 5 to 6 million eggs. By the time we're born, we have 1 to 2 million. By the time we start our periods, we've got about 400,000. And then basically we kind of use a few, waste a few, and by the time we get to 50, we've got about 100 eggs left. And that's where the age thing comes from. It's just currently where we are in our age, in our chronology, when we're running out of eggs. And so whilst the brain is trying to tell our ovaries to work, the ovaries, if there's no eggs, the function really fades away, doesn't it? And therefore we don't produce as much estrogen and as much progesterone. We do still continue to make a little bit of testosterone, but in smaller amounts than when we were kind of in our 20s. But what is driving the majority of symptoms that women are going to notice around the menopause is the lack of estrogen. Some would argue definitely there's a role for progesterone, but the vast majority of symptoms are because we are lacking estrogen, and also because this thing doesn't happen overnight. It does for women who have their ovaries removed, but we've already said that duration of symptoms is over years, not months usually, and so your ovarian function is waxing and waning, so the fluctuation in symptoms is often what's causing symptoms as well. When does it occur? Well, the average age in the UK is 51, but of course we're not all Mrs. Average, and it's going to be a kind of time span there, a variation. So the normal age range would be between 45 and 55 years. I've seen women who are having regular bleeds, although having menopausal symptoms, and they're 56 or older, but obviously that's less common. We would call it an early menopause if somebody's between the ages of 40 and 45 when they go through their change. About 1 in 100 women will be under the age of 40 when they have their menopause, and we would call that now, unlike premature menopause here, it's actually called POI, so premature ovarian insufficiency is the kind of current term for that. And one of the reasons for insufficiency, not failure, is because it's, as I was describing, the ovarian function waxes and wanes. So, you know, it's there for a bit, it goes, but obviously reduced estrogen levels have an impact on bone health and cardiovascular health. And we've talked much more about that this morning than I was planning to talk about in this session, because this is more about, obviously, a focused area on the workplace. About 1 in 1,000 women are under 30.
I just wanted to ask you a quick question about that slide.
Yes.
I noticed your data's UK data. Do you
Yes.
see much of a difference in the age range in other ethnic minority groups, for example?
So in different countries, so yes, in developing countries it tends to be maybe slightly younger. So in the developed world, on average, it's about 18 months older. Interestingly, smokers tend to go through their menopause 18 months earlier as well. But it seems to be more kind of geographical rather than populations. You know, it seems to be more where you live rather than your genetic makeup. You know, but that's probably something that,
So sort of socio-economic circumstance and
I mean, but again, you could draw in smoking, couldn't you, and all those other factors. So multifactorial probably. Yeah, thank you. So symptoms. This is slide 1 of 4. Okay, and you know, I think whilst obviously we haven't got time to discuss each one of these in great detail, what I would say is that when you ask women what do you think of symptoms, or men for that matter, what would you tell me? If I said what are the symptoms of menopause, you'd say flushes and sweats. Yeah. So 80% of women will have those, but 1 in 5 women then won't. And even NICE guidance says around the diagnosis that we should be looking at the diagnosis of menopause on vasomotor symptoms, which to you and me is flushes and sweats, and changes in periods. But we've got to remember that not every woman gets them, but changes in periods. And what I wanted to draw your attention to is that that could be lots of different things. So it could be that stopping of periods, it could be that, you know, it just becomes totally erratic. I mean, obviously then as a doctor, you know, we have to decide if somebody needs investigation, but from a management perspective and thinking about your workforce, this could be that I woke up this morning, I wasn't expecting a bleed, it's now lunchtime, I'm flooding. You know, how is that going to impact on people that are working for you? I would ask you to consider. So periods can be more frequent, they can be less frequent, they can be heavier, they can be lighter. It's like anything can happen, so think about that. You know, poor sleep, yes, it can be you wake up with a hot flush, but actually you can have insomnia totally separate to flushing and sweating, and it can be numerous times a night. You know, I see women and I ask them about sleep, and it could be I'm getting 3 to 4 hours a night. So for our age group, ideally we should be sleeping 7 to 9 hours, and mostly we're not getting enough sleep, any of us. But actually, if you think about the impact of kind of on a chronic level, that is going to impact our performance, isn't it? So of course, tiredness, loss of energy, headaches, you can get migraine as part of that, new onset migraine or a worsening. So you may have colleagues that are suffering, and if you've ever had a migraine, had a family member with migraine, you know, generally that's something that is not going to be able to manage in the workplace, is it? And aches and pains, you know, just generally waking up, women saying to me, you know, overnight I just felt 90, you know, and a lot of that is around aches and pains. Hair loss, formication, careful how we say that, is that thing where if you see somebody and they're like this and they're, you know, just kind of looking as though they've got something crawling all over them. That's how they feel, you know, and actually they probably haven't got scabies, actually it's just that they're feeling itchy. Palpitations, quite a scary thing if you wake up in the middle of the night with it, but actually that could be just menopause. Emotional symptoms, I would say of all the women I see, and they're coming to a menopause clinic, anxiety, I would say, is extremely debilitating. And it could be low mood, it could be, you know, I'm not depressed, I know I'm not depressed, but I feel really black. I just can't get rid of this. And if you've ever suffered from a hormonal change and felt like that, you know, it's very powerful. And feeling irritable, and as we discussed this morning, you know, it may not be you, maybe somebody you're sitting next to who's very irritable, you know, and if it's in the context of this, and you're seeing them sitting next to that person every day of the week, that's quite challenging. So anxiety attacks and panic disorder, you know, people who have a panic attack think they're going to die. It's horrible. Loss of interest in most things, you know, that's even the fun things at home. And so how might work be if you know, in that scenario? Talked a little bit around periods and that, but we also must kind of remember that bladder function can change. So under the influence of lack of estrogen, when you need a wee, and it's not going to happen to me now, and I will probably talk quite colloquially, sorry, you know, it's probably work in sexual health, isn't it? But if you need a wee and you need it now, that's like, I'm leaving this presentation. It doesn't matter if I'm live streaming, but I've got to go, you know. So that could be one of the things that might be affecting the women in your teams. Vaginal dryness, soreness and itch, and that could be related to sex, but it might just be in wearing certain clothes, trousers, jeans. Sex drive, obviously, you know, as women, we're kind of quite complex, you guys might have noticed, but, you know, our psychosexual pathways are a little complex, and sex is going to be down the bottom of the list, and you might think, well, yeah, but that's not going to affect my performance in work. But if you're not communicating with your partner because they think you're having an affair because you're not interested in sex and you're rowing or you're not communicating, then you might bring some of that angst into the workplace, might you? And this is really important in the workplace, isn't it? The fourth one on cognitive function, because actually loss of memory, reduced concentration, and just a general feeling of I'm not coping. But who would actually admit? Maybe on a symptom score we might, but would we admit we're not coping? I put it to you that most of us wouldn't. So this is a British Menopause Society survey from 2016, and what I highlight at the top bit really is saying that although, you know, the average number of symptoms, thankfully, we don't get all of them on the list, but we probably get 6 or 7 of them, and each woman will be different. Herein lies the challenge, but half of the women who are getting lots of symptoms despite that won't actually go and seek any help. And, you know, the thing here around 1/5 is basically saying, well, you know, actually it was a lot worse. I wasn't expecting to get memory problems. I wasn't expecting that I'd have achy joints, you know. And 42% of women felt that their symptoms were worse or much worse than they expected them to be. And we know generally that about a quarter of women find that their symptoms are severe. More than a third in the survey felt that work had indeed impacted their work life, which is relevant to us today, isn't it? So, 7 in 10 women are having to make a change to life. 1 in 3 don't seem to do much about it. And I always think this is interesting that 6 in 10 families want to support women. And I always think, well, what about the other 4? They're just happy to let them get on with it. But 4 in 10 as partners just feel utterly helpless. And I was thinking, you know, are you actually going to say to your female partner, is it your hormones, love? You know, I mean, no. Rare to brag to a bug. 3 or more days of sick leave per year, which are menopause related in this study. Very relevant to us now. So, that's just the thing. I'm just going to take a few minutes now to tell you a bit about the research. This is a paper that was published in Maturitas, and Professor Amanda Griffiths is based at Nottingham Uni in the division of, she's a psychologist, and she did a piece of work on which a lot of the, kind of over the past few years, you might have been aware that a lot's been happening in menopause generally, but also in the workplace. And a lot of the work and recommendations are coming from this study. So basically they set out to find out what were the perceived effects of menopausal symptoms on work and also vice versa. What were the effects of work on menopause? And clearly then they wanted to make some recommendations. And it was an electronic questionnaire. They targeted women between 45 and 55 of over 10 organisations, and they were professional, managerial and administrative roles. and it was a decent sample size, just under 900 women completed it, and they were a mix of women that were in the perimenopause, women who were in the natural menopause, and I should have said before, you know, that obviously some women undergo very acute menopause when they've had surgery, and they may be younger women for whom a sudden loss of estrogen is very impactful, and only kind of less than 1 in 5 women were actually replacing their hormones. So, these are the symptoms most commonly reported as problematic for work. And I think probably if you think about the symptom slide we've discussed, you know, it's probably not a shocker to realise that these are the things. But lowered confidence isn't actually something we've said, but not surprising if you think of the context of those other symptoms. If your performance is going down, your confidence is in your boots. Hot flushes, and 35% that these were a problem in work. So how did women kind of cope? Because this is what we want to know. If they're happening in work, well, how did they get by? Well, you know, the things that made it difficult in the workplace, and it's probably a little warm in here, but hot and ventilated offices and workspaces, formal meetings proved difficult for 2/3 of women. Things like doing this, presentations, learning new things in our work. How often are we constantly undergoing change and development? And this was difficult for women. And they found that tasks that required, you know, very focused and attention to detail, obviously, being in a shared office, you know, if you're feeling irritable, you've not slept, then that's difficult. So how did the women try and help with that? Well, they tried to cool down, so that might be having a cold glass of water, using a fan, actually going outside to get some fresh air. Thankfully, you know, one of the reasons for setting up the session we did this morning was around the fact that talking to each other helps, talking to other women, wearing appropriate clothing, so layering. Then we bring in how does that fit in with wearing uniforms, don't we? But actually, very British answer, well, we joke about it, don't we? You know, we kind of try and look on the bright side, and that's one of our coping strategies. Information is power, so women felt better if they found out about it, and talking to somebody about how I'm feeling, sharing that burden. And this is important for you guys, I think, that at the bottom, 88% of women double-checked their work. Now, that's going to have an impact on capacity, isn't it? Lots of note-making, I find myself doing the same thing. Exercising, choosing tasks according to tiredness and concentration levels is important. Yes, they're going to try and get to bed earlier and get more sleep, but they may not sleep when they get there. This is also important for the workplace, the next one, isn't it? Avoid interaction with others. If you work in a shared office and people just think you're being rude or, you know, but actually it could be because you're going through all this. But also half of the women took time off work. So if you ask women, how do you think their work performance has been affected? 1/3 will say, you know, yes, I think it was. 1/3 will say, no, not at all. And the others won't let you know, because actually, like I alluded to before, would you actually admit that competencies are down or your work performance is down? This was, remember, it was an anonymous survey, but they still didn't feel able to answer that question. Perhaps they didn't know. So the other interesting thing is that they didn't feel able to discuss, only 1/4 of them had shared their symptoms with the line manager, even though 12% had taken a day off work. Half of that number didn't share the real reason. And why not? Well, it's private, isn't it? It's personal. It doesn't affect my work. It's embarrassing. My line manager's male and younger, so I'm not working towards a conversation where I can share. And so, we're going to move on to have a think about what situations you might be in, where you might have to come up with some of the solutions here. And then after that, I'll share with you what the guidance says. Is that okay? So I'll say bye to our online viewers.